Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tracking a journey that is honestly entirely unique in American history. We're looking at the multi-stage evolution of Ronald Reagan. Relying strictly on the historical record, we're going to see how one man shifted through radically different phases of life, completely transforming both his career and his worldview along the way.
It really boils down to one massive question, right? How does a small-town sports broadcaster eventually become the 40th president of the United States? Well, when you actually break down his life, it's a literal masterclass in career pivoting and communication. Every single phase of his early life laid a super specific brick in the foundation for the leader he'd eventually become. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap. We're going to hit 4 distinct chapters: small-town roots, the Hollywood years, his leap from union leader to GE, and finally, the political shift.
Chapter 1. Small-town roots.
So, born in Tampico, Illinois back in 1911, his upbringing was deeply shaped by his parents. His mother, Nell, heavily influenced his spirituality. She was incredibly committed to the disciples of Christ and a social gospel. On the flip side, his father struggled with alcoholism, which forced a really young Reagan to navigate some pretty complex emotional landscapes early on. The family eventually settled in Dixon, and that's where he took his very first job as a lifeguard at the Rock River. Now, what's genuinely notable here is that at a time when segregation was the norm, his parents held unusually progressive stances on racial equality. For example, when 2 of his black college football teammates were refused service at a local hotel, Reagan just invited them right back to his parents' house, where they were warmly welcomed. Moving on to his college years, they actually perfectly previewed his future. He went to Eureka College, studied economics and sociology, though by his own admission, he was kind of a mediocre student. But you've got to look at his extracurriculars. He played football, did cheerleading, and was heavily involved in drama. Perhaps most wild of all, he was elected student body president and actually led a student strike that's successfully resulting in the college president resigning. It's right there that he really started building those foundational skills in public communication, performance, and leadership.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, the Hollywood years.
His jump into entertainment was honestly incredible. He started out as a sports broadcaster for WHO Radio in Des Moines, Iowa. But his real superpower, recreating vivid play-by-play accounts of Chicago Cubs baseball games. But here's the catch. He wasn't even at the games. He was literally using bare-bones, telegraph-wired descriptions that came in while the game was happening, using nothing but his imagination and his voice to paint this thrilling picture for the listeners. That unique ability to perform seamlessly translated to film. In 1936, while traveling with the Cubs, he took a Warner Brothers screen test. By 1937, boom, he's living in Hollywood with a 7-year contract.
Now here is a truly staggering number, 53. That is the massive number of feature films he made before wrapping up his cinematic career. Using a pretty direct, simple approach to acting, he started in B-movies but totally broke out portraying George Gipp in the 1940 film Knute Rockne, All-American. And yes, that is exactly where his famous nickname, the Gipper, comes from. Many critics actually consider his absolute best performance to be his role as an amputee in the 1942 film King's Row. That was the exact role that propelled him to true stardom.
But then, World War II interrupted that stardom. He had enlisted in the Army Reserve in 1937 and got ordered to active duty in 1942. His severe nearsightedness, however, kept him stateside. He was assigned to the Army Air Forces as a public relations officer out in Culver City, California. Now, this is an absolutely vital period for understanding his later political worldview. Because he was stationed stateside dealing with military administration, he developed these deep, early frustrations with federal bureaucracy. He felt it was literally impossible to remove incompetent or lazy workers just because of sheer administrative inefficiency.
But despite all that frustration, he was incredibly productive. He didn't abandon his Hollywood skills at all during his service. Actually, he used them to produce over 400 training films for the military before being discharged as a captain in 1945. Think about that volume.
Moving into the post-war era, we hit Chapter 3, Union Leader to GE.
So the crucial point here is seeing exactly how an acting career led straight into high-pressure labor leadership. His time leading the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, was basically a masterclass in political maneuvering. He was elected president of the union twice, in 1947 and again in 1959. During that time, he had to navigate some seriously intense labor and political issues: the Taft-Hartley Act, major studio strikes, and the incredibly fraught era of the Hollywood blacklist. He even testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee. But by his second term, he successfully fought for and secured monumental residual payments and pensions for actors. He was learning exactly how to negotiate, how to represent a massive constituency, and how to operate in a highly polarized environment.
As his film career started slowing down, he made a super lucrative pivot to television, hosting the General Electric Theater in the 1950s. When people asked him how he managed to recruit such massive stars for early television, which was, pretty uncertain back then, he just said, good stories, top direction, production quality. But his GE work wasn't just on camera. He actually worked as a motivational speaker for the company, touring their plants and speaking directly to employees. This marked a very clear transition into a corporate spokesperson role.
Which naturally leads us to Chapter 4, the political shift.
To objectively understand this massive ideological shift, we really have to recognize where he started out. Early in his career, he was a vocal liberal activist. He joined the American Veterans Committee, worked with the AFL-CIO against right-to-work laws. In 1946, he went on a radio program called Operation Terror and vehemently condemned the Ku Klux Klan, calling their activities a capably organized, systematic campaign of fascist violence and intimidation and horror.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of his political evolution. As an early Democrat, he viewed Franklin D. Roosevelt as a true hero and actively backed Harry Truman's 1948 presidential campaign. But as he spent the 1950s touring the country giving speeches for General Electric, his views steadily shifted to the right. He started speaking really favorably about free markets, supported the campaigns of Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, and by 1961, he was publicly criticizing the proposed Medicare legislation, arguing that it threatened individual freedom.
The final cementing of this transformation, that happened in 1962. That very same year, he was dropped by GE and his television show got canceled. He formally registered as a Republican. His new political identity was fully solidified. He had officially moved from a New Deal Democrat to an emerging conservative voice.
From that point on, his rise was just meteoric. Propelled by his famous A Time for Choosing speech in 1964, he successfully ran for governor of California in 1966. And then, just 2 years later in 1968, he and his advisors were already setting their sights on the presidency, running as a compromise candidate in the Republican primaries. Even though Richard Nixon secured the nomination that year, the stage was undeniably set.
So we end our explainer today by reflecting on this really provocative question. How do the communication skills built in broadcasting and acting ultimately shape the strategy of a world leader? When you look back at the sports announcer reading telegraph wires, the actor hitting his marks, the union president negotiating contracts, and the corporate spokesman touring factories, you see the construction of a totally unique toolkit. It's a toolkit that would eventually define a presidency and an entire era of American politics. I hope diving into the historical record today gave you a much clearer understanding of this extraordinary evolution. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep exploring.